Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly 30-minute radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. Every Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Vaughan Woodruff and Bill Dunn. Vaughan Woodruff is a former CEO and founder of InSource Renewables, and Vaughan's experience within the local and national solar industry is broad. Vaughan has been an outspoken advocate for renewable energy in Maine and has extensive experience implementing solar power within the central Maine power Avangrid Iberdrola utility territory. He has testified at the Public Utility Commission and is a powerful advocate for new legislation in Maine that would create a public power utility, Pine Tree Tower, to protect the people of Maine from Avangrid's incompetent, unreliable service and obstruction of distributed solar power. Bill Dunn is the president of Sunset Point LLC. He specializes in electricity market design and implementation, ancillary services, utility and power pool market operations, inter-utility coordination, contractual power supply arrangements, and transmission access, and pricing. He has 49 years of experience. He started when he was 6, of experience in working with electric utility organizations of all ownership types, whether it's a public, private, local, and federal. And he has held senior positions in utilities and on power pool market committees. So Bill is also a leading advocate and lobbyist for the newly proposed public power legislation in Maine and has testified extensively about the failures of Central Maine Power. So we're going to speak with both of them in just a minute. And as their bios clearly indicate, they know they have the experience we're going to be looking for. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. If you haven't been tracking Retake's blogs on the Avangrid Iberdrola situation, this is going to be a very interesting conversation, so stay tuned. But before we do get to Bill and Vaughan, a couple of quick announcements. Last week, we spoke with Allegra Love, a longtime New Mexico immigration and refugee advocate, the founder and director of Santa Fe Dreamers Project. She stepped down from the position just about a year ago. And when I saw her newsletter and Facebook post last week, or actually it was now 2 weeks ago, I featured them in a blog post and I thought it would be good to catch up with her. And indeed it was. She was a powerful interview, putting the border crisis in a very human perspective. So if you missed it, you can listen to that show and any of our shows, including this one, by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the Actions and Events menu, and clicking on Retake Conversations. And all of our shows for the past 5 years are located there. And before we get started with our main friends, as is our practice, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this interview on stolen Tewa land. And we want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. So let's get started. Welcome, Bill and Vaughan. It's been our practice on Retake Our Democracy to allow our guests to introduce themselves. So let's start with you, Vaughan. How about if you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So I got some deep roots here in Maine. My family's been in central Maine. I'm the 6th generation out this way. And I've been in the renewable energy industry for the better part of almost 15 years, started in Montana and moved back home here to Maine about a dozen years ago. And I've been heavily involved. I was the chair of our solar industry trade group here in the state for a number of years under a governor that was pretty anti-solar. I've got a bunch of friends in New Mexico. One of my mentors, Chuck Markin, actually lives in Albuquerque and spent a bunch of time in your lovely state. Spent some time up in the Window Rock area on the Navajo Nation as well. So really pleased to join in the conversation here.
Okay, Bill, how about you?
Well, I'm a native New Englander, but not a native Mainer. I grew up in Western Massachusetts and have lived in Central Massachusetts, Vermont, a little bit in New Hampshire, and moved to Maine 23 years ago after a 5-year sojourn to the Washington, D.C. area, which was terrible. But anyways, I've been living up here for 23 years. And one of the things that struck me moving up to here was it's the first place I've ever lived where I had to worry about my electricity supply, because all of a sudden I found that I kept having these outages every year. So now I have a generator out next to my garage. Actually, it's in the garage and I have to reel it out each time. But anyways, I've been working in the industry for a long time, worked all over the world, 25 plus countries. And about a year and a half ago, a colleague from my days working with the municipals in Massachusetts called me up and said, hey, we're finally decided we're going to try to do something about the terrible reliability and customer service in Maine. Would you like to join the effort? And so I've been an unpaid volunteer ever since.
Okay, well, I'm familiar with the dynamic of unpaid volunteerism, so welcome to the club. And so I thought what we would do today, because I've read quite a bit about what's going on in Maine, and I'm struck with the just extraordinary similarities to the situation here in New Mexico. And so I think it's going to be helpful for our listeners who are getting buried in television ads and mailers telling us just how wonderful Avangrid is, and how wonderful and what a great ally they're going to be. And I know it has been a different experience in Maine and almost anywhere else that Avangrid goes, or Iberdrola. So I thought we'd start with you, Vaughan, because you were around in the beginning years with Avangrid. And I'm just curious, because the initial reaction here from a lot of environmentalists was, ooh, Iberdrola, like huge renewable, most ethical company in the top 10, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you've seen it all. And it didn't play out that way in Maine. So what was the initial reaction when they said they were going to form Central Maine Power? And what has been the initial, what was the initial experience?
Yeah, great background, Paul. So, CMP, Central Maine Power, started as a small little electrical shop back in the mid 1900s. I moved back home to Maine right around the time that they became associated with Iberdrola. And then the Avangrid US subsidiary started back in, I think, 2015. So that was about 6 years ago, which was actually right at the heart of, where we started to run into a lot of high level conflict with regards to solar policy here in Maine. I didn't have a ton of contrast right prior to Iberdrola's involvement, having just moved back around that time. I will say that Iberdrola sold itself a lot as, look at the portfolio that we have around the world, our investments in renewables. We're a company that's committed to renewables. We're really big about doing what you say you do. And I think CMP has struggled mightily in the time that I've been here. And I'm sure it didn't just start when I got back home, where, what gets sold and what gets delivered are two very, very different experiences. We've seen CMP align itself very heavily with the Edison Institute, which is the trade group for the investor-owned utilities. There was a document a number of years ago that was put out by the Edison Institute regarding, the disruptive challenges of the PV industry, and, had two major recommendations. One was figure out how to monetize the benefit as a utility and see how you can, influence policy and work solar into your business model. And secondarily is to fight tooth and nail at the legislature in your state to slow down or even reverse some of the gains with the expansion of solar. And CMP took that textbook and went right to work here in Maine. For 5 to 6 years, actively spending more money than any other lobbyists here in the Capitol in Augusta, to influence policy, and specifically to beat back goals for Maine to, implement solar policy that was consistent with our neighbors here in New England.
So that's so similar to our P&M. And so that's why I think when this merger was announced, many people's initial reaction was, oh my God, we're going to get rid of P&M. And then we started digging and going, oh my God, this is like P&M on steroids. Bill, did you want to add, like, how did you wind up getting involved? What was it that ticked you to go? I mean, I know you got a phone call to get involved, but you've got a lot of experience in the industry. And so contrast this with your experience in other places.
Well, what I would start with is before I went into consulting in '89, I worked in New England. I worked for the Vermont Electric Power Company in Vermont, and then I worked for the Massachusetts Municipal Wholesale Electric Company. And in both roles, I was very involved with the regional organization back then called the New England Power Pool, which was the market and operations. Now that's run by ISO New England, but there still is a New England Power Pool, which is just the organization of all the utilities. And so back then I chaired the operations committee for a couple of years in the late '80s for all of New England. And, and I worked closely with the CMP people back then. And before Versant, there was, several steps before that, there was Bangor Hydro, which is now part of Versant. And I worked with both of those utilities. And they had good reputations in the New England Power Pool. And so I was somewhat surprised when I came back and found that reputation had gone away. So,
To be kind.
So it's I think it's what changed in the interim. Well, Bangor Hydro was bought by Emera, which was then bought by the city of Calgary through their NMAX subsidiary and called Versant. And CMP, I think, first went through Energy East and then was bought by Iberdrola Avangrid. So the big change was they were no longer local utilities, probably with boards of local utility, local Mainers and stuff, but they became these part of these big conglomerates and taking direction from their foreign owners. So it was a change in direction and change in management. And there's no reason it can't be turned around by putting the management, the boards back in the control of Mainers.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because this is exactly what, they're trying to get in the door here. So they're talking a nice act and saying, we want to do all these things, but they're resisting completely the idea of a local board. They're just saying that's not how we do business, And
one difference maybe between where your situation and ours is in Maine, the transmission and distribution utilities can't own generation.
Oh, okay.
So when in the P&M situation, you're looking at Iberdrola is all they're building out of wind turbines and stuff like that. Well, they couldn't come into Maine and do that because they were prohibited by owning the T&D system. They can't build the generation. And so maybe they have a strength in building renewable resources, but they certainly haven't demonstrated a strength in running a transmission and distribution only utility.
So we'll get to that in terms of that's an important difference, and I'm glad you brought it up. But you mentioned almost in the passive voice that their reputation went away, and it kind of didn't just went away. It kind of changed because of actions and poor performance on their part. So let's start with, I don't know which came first, the reliability issue or the billing system that they implemented, but maybe we should start with the reliability because I think that might have been the first evidence that maybe things weren't going to go right. So Vaughan, you see you're nodding your head, so the radio listeners can't see that. But Vaughan, do you want to comment on what happened in terms of their reliability?
Certainly. So, the the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration goes through and does studies on, which states are experiencing the most frequent outages and the longest outages. And Maine, over the last subset of years, has historically been worst. If you look at an aggregation, we're by far worse than any other state in the country. A lot of investment has been focused in larger transmission upgrades. So we went through, the Maine, what they call the Power Reliability Project, and that was set up, to basically make investments and gold plate the transmission system. Meanwhile, the distribution system, in terms of tree maintenance and preventative approaches, has gone down quite a bit. And when that was reaching a threshold, I think Paul was right around the time where the billing system issues happened as well. And as a result of the two together, another national metric that we have is basically customer satisfaction. There's an annual survey of various utilities, and CMP has been below every utility in the country by that metric, including PG&E, which pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter of 84 people in California because of the campfires. So CMP is less popular than a utility in California that's actually killed its ratepayers, which is JD Power. If you go through and look at their both residential and their commercial customer satisfaction, CMP has been at the bottom in those over the last 3 to 4 years as well.
Wow. Do you have anything to add to that, Bill?
Well, that was, Vaughan just gave a great summary of what was the focus of my testimony that I filed here in Maine, which includes a vast amount of the reliability data coming from the Energy Information Administration and the JD Power data. But when Vaughan correctly noted their investment in transmission, I also included in my testimony the fact that, well, for example, for CMP, they're in the last 10 years, from 2011 to 2020, their transmission rates have doubled. They've gone up 100%. Their distribution rates have gone up 15%. So they are definitely putting all their money in transmission. Why? They get higher rate of return. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates transmission rates, and I don't think they've ever seen an investment they didn't like. So they get a high rate of return on every dollar they spend. In the distribution system, they earn a lower rate of return, and it's not as much fun, I don't think. So they don't put enough money into their distribution system. I indicated earlier, I worked with the munis in Massachusetts, and in their systems, when their big storms would hit, would stay alive for the most part when a lot of the IOU systems would fall down. Why was that? The municipals seem to take a longer view, a life cycle cost view of their distribution system. And so in areas, in high risk areas where there's trees and stuff like that, they use insulated wire, sometimes insulated wire supported by a strong carrying cable. So they would tell me about cases where big storm, they go out, there's a tree leaning against their line, but because of the carrying cable, the line doesn't come down, and because of the insulation, the line doesn't short out. So all they got to do is send out a tree crew, cut it away, and all's good. Up here,
PG&E probably should have talked to these folks a few years ago.
Yeah, up here, a strong wind blows and everything falls over. So it's a different philosophy, a different economic outlook. And I think the consumer-owned utilities take a longer view, and what they spend up front on capital, they save in the long run on maintenance. We end up paying for all these remote crews from Canada and New York and everything to come into Maine every time there's a storm to put the system back together again. There's just, what Versant just applied for a 26% rate increase, and CMP is in for a $26 million rate increase to cover the cost of the last storm. And I've heard rumors that they filed at FERC for another transmission rate increase. Although I went to find that, but I couldn't find it yet.
Well, if you find it, please send it along because the amount of evidence keeps piling up. I don't know if you saw the report from the Financial Times yesterday, but in Spain, they are investigating the CEO of Iberdrola for conspiracy to, oh shoot, I can't remember what it was, but it's like corporate malfeasance in spades. And so these are the people that are, you know, so ethical that they want to work with us. So what are the kinds of things that you face in the political ramifications to this, in terms of, you know, okay, one of the things we're find here in New Mexico all the time is there are clear solutions to some of our problems, and that those clear solutions are never even considered. They're off the table because they're not financially lucrative for capitalist investors in the state and so forth, whether it's gas and oil or energy. What happens in the Maine legislature that impedes making any kind of meaningful progress?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one, Paul. So I think it's really critical to understand that in Maine, while we blame CMP and other utilities for reliability, fundamentally, you know, they're regulated monopolies, and our Public Utilities Commission is responsible for regulating those monopolies. And this is where I think is a really important point for New Mexicans to understand about how Iberdrola, Avangrid, CMP have operated in Maine, which is to exercise as much political power as they can and permeate as much of our regulatory process as they can in order to maximize profits for their shareholders, which, you know, that's their charge as a corporation, is to do that. They set an example, I believe, of kind of the extreme of that, which is the amount of money that they spend on lobbyists. I mean, our former governor sits on, you know, their board of directors and has a pretty cushy, I think, $200,000 a year check on there. We see Public Utilities Commission commissioners that, you know, move off of their seat directly into working for Avangrid. We have their folks that are involved in the financial campaigns for major office here in Maine. And so some of the conversations stop before they even have an opportunity to begin because of just how thick the political influence is of Central Maine Power here in Maine, which, you know, as a descendant of farmers and as a trained engineer, I try to stay away from very extremist statements. And I don't think it's extremist to say that CMP's actions here in Maine are affecting our democracy because of how much they are willing to spend to subvert the processes that are supposed to be in place to hold them accountable.
Does any of this sound familiar, New Mexicans? This is exactly the situation here. Bill, do you have any thoughts on that, or is your expertise in the utilities and not so much in the legislature?
Well, unfortunately, I got over the last couple of years or a few years ago working on ranked choice voting, and then this effort, I've learned more than I had a desire to about the legislative process, and especially the 5 days I spent recently up at the State House, and just seeing the number of lobbyists CMP has up there, and you can kind of tell them. They're the guys in the fancy suits,
Right.
and you know, and they have these little tiny name tags that you can barely read unless you get right up close to them. You know, and all of our lobbyists were people like me, unpaid people, just trying to buttonhole, one of the legislators. And what was interesting, one of our Republican sponsors of the bill got 3 of us to get invited into the Republican caucus, House caucus. Well, that was a disaster. I mean, we got in there. One of our members made a brief opening statement, got one question, which we answered, and then one of the Republicans in the pocket of CMP got up and made 10, 15-minute long rambling rant about the evil of what we were trying to do and all this stuff, used up all the rest of the time we had, and then they threw us out. So, whereas CMP, as I understand it, gets invited into that caucus all the time. So, I mean, it's not a level playing field. It's not necessarily a debate among ideas.
Okay.
It's who's got the money.
Yeah, Vaughn, you had another comment, and then we've got about 4 minutes left in the show, and I'd like to make sure we talk about the transmission line through the forest. So Vaughn, what was
Yeah,
your?
I want to add something to Bill's piece because I've seen that in the Republican caucus. I think the important piece to recognize too is that it's across the parties and it's
Right.
across the interests. So, for instance, this will be a segue, Paul, into your next piece. We've seen a bit of a defeatist mentality as far as initiatives that get pushed by CMP. The expectation from high-level regulators and folks within the government that if CMP pushes it, it's likely going to go through, and the question becomes, what do we get out of it? So we've even seen, quote unquote environmental organizations in Maine that have come to the table and negotiated away some of, the rights and interests of the people of Maine in order to kind of make sure that they're getting a cut to make it, and in turn it substantiates kind of the clean energy chops at times of the utility, even though they're only coming to the table if there's a significant monetary incentive for them to do so.
And that's our experience also. The Sierra Club here and Western Resources and a number of other environmental groups will split off and try and wrangle something, and very often they get hoodwinked. So we've got 2 minutes, and I'd like you to spend it talking to us about the transmission line issue, and then the legislative effort to get a public power.
In 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes. Oh, I should tell you that I will cut you off at 29 minutes, and then we'll pause for a minute, and maybe we can take the question about the legislative effort to get a public utility on the full blog, because on the full podcast, because the podcast can go over 29 minutes, the radio show can't. So let's just talk about the transmission line from Canada through your forests.
As the resident of that area, closest to that area, I'm happy to jump on it. So essentially, there's been a big effort by a previous gubernatorial administration to tap into what's seen as low cost electricity from Quebec and inject that into our New England grid. And what's been proposed is essentially cutting a swath of woods through some of the most rural areas of Maine in order to deliver that energy. The hardest part of that whole conversation beyond that impact has been CMP's willingness to brand it as the New England Clean Energy Corridor while fighting every effort in the regulatory bodies when accountability is held. They're trying to hold to account for those claims of climate. Essentially, what's going to happen from everything I've seen is it's going to shift power from other markets into the Massachusetts market to meet their renewable goals and force other states like New York to find generation elsewhere, which to me is, additionality is where we attack climate, not just by making, all of a sudden it's clean in New England, but it's going to have to be dirty somewhere else. So that's been a huge issue that's gone on, and there's been a huge groundswell. I have not seen an issue where people from the far left, far right, independent have seen such strong agreement as the corridor. And yet still CMP is finding ways to push against the public effort to.
Okay, well, we're going to talk more with Bill and Vaughn in just a minute on the podcast, but that's all for the show today. We'll be back next week. I think the focus is going to be on K-12 education next week, so stay tuned. Okay, we're back, and we just do that little pause there so the radio station engineer can find where the radio show ends and our blithering continues. So what what we just heard is that they're, you know, for reasons that are undoubtedly, you were talking earlier that anything that costs a lot of money, they make more money on. So rather than allow for local solar to generate even less expensive energy on which they won't profit much at all, this is the avenue they take. Is that pretty much the analysis?
Yeah, they get a good rate of return on infrastructure investment. And a lot of their focus is shift towards that instead of their primary responsibility, which is providing energy for ratepayers.
I mean, that it's an interesting project in that their advertisements for it make me fear for what's going to happen if our public power legislation passes, you know, the Senate next week and then gets past the governor and goes to referendum this fall, which is what the legislation says, because the misleading ads will be unbelievable, because the misleading ads that CMP keeps running for their Clean Energy Connect are truly amazing. The implications that there's benefits to Mainers when the amount of energy allocated to Maine is probably within the rounding error or monthly variation in people's bills. The fact that they say, well, we're going to use, most of it uses existing corridor, without saying, yeah, but that existing ugly corridor is going to be expanded to make room for the new line that goes alongside the existing lines. They say it's going to improve reliability, and it's a DC line, which means it won't provide any instantaneous reliability help when something trips. DC lines just run at whatever level they're set at, unless they operate in a frequency sensitive mode. And the only one I know that does that is between the North and South Islands in New Zealand. So, I mean, it's just misleading ad after misleading ad.
And our listeners will be familiar with that from P&M, but it looks like we're getting it in steroids now. So this has led Mainers to unite, and I heard Vaughan say that this enjoys support from the left and the right, to create public power. And that is something that we have a working group here in New Mexico that's looking at doing the same thing. So what has been your experience doing that? How did you, I'm imagining your legal or legislative process differs a little bit from ours in that we don't need the governor's signature to go to the voters. But we do need to get it through the legislature. So what is your experience with trying to get this on the ballot?
Well, I mean, my understanding is it started about 3 years ago. Like I said, I got involved about 1.5 years ago, and the legislation at that time, you know, it had some problems, but working for the last 1.5 years, we think we've cleaned up some of those problems. The biggest one being making sure the towns and the municipals would feel safe that their property tax, they wouldn't lose property tax revenues. And the legislation is pretty specific that the Pine Tree Power Company would have to make payments in lieu of taxes equivalent to the property taxes that the investor-owned utilities would have paid on existing facilities and would pay on new facilities. So
that's good information.
I think we've resolved that, the current legislation. Not that, you know, it couldn't be tweaked in some ways, possibly, but it's pretty tight. And the process is we have to get it through our legislature, and then the governor either has to sign it to approve it, veto it, or, and this is where my legislative experience is not good enough. I understand it can go past the governor without her approval, but still be enacted. And then it goes to what the legislation includes is specific language for a referendum for the people to vote on it in November. So even if once it gets past the legislature and the governor, it's still not law until the people vote on it. And if it doesn't get past the legislature and the governor, then we will launch a signature campaign and the people will put it on the referendum next year. And I don't think the governor or the legislature really wants that to happen. Because I think it'll be pretty easy to collect 80,000 signatures if we're at the polls this November, when all the people who hate the corridor project are voting to kill the corridor project. So
very good, very good. I'm happy with you guys. Good fight. Tell us a little bit about what from my understanding, initially this corridor enjoyed the success of almost every one of the jurisdictions along the way, the little townships. And what we heard was that this was done by Central Maine or Avangrid going and basically spouting a bunch of nonsense to, you know, individual members of different township committees or councils, and getting and saying, oh, okay, that sounds great. And then when the those same townships looked under the hood, they all were aghast, and now all of them are opposed. So can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, CMP has historically flexes its muscle in local municipalities as well as at the state level. For instance, when the MPRP project, the Maine Power Reliability Project I referenced before, came through, they came into our small town of about 4,200 people and sat in the council. And I mean, there was basically forced sale of properties in Pittsfield to make way for that project. I think it actually went around Bill's community at the time. I think that some local action helped to divert. No, not Yarmouth.
What they did was they wanted to bring another 345 kV line in and create a big substation kind of on the Cumberland Yarmouth border. I actually got hired by a bunch of local citizens to oppose that, and I filed testimony at the PUC. I actually had maps in there showing there was a better place to put it out in West Falmouth, where they wouldn't be dragging another 345 kV line within a couple of 100 feet of a whole neighborhoods, two big neighborhoods in Yarmouth. But again, going back to what one talked about earlier, their political pressure or their political influence in Augusta made it clear that there was just too much political support for the project, and they didn't listen to my advice.
and we see that across the board. I mean, we have a lot of poor old mill towns, old farming towns. A lot of the communities where this is cutting through are aging and have lost a lot of industry. And you know, it's easy to kind of come in and bully local municipalities. Or I think in this case, it just, the scale of the project wasn't known when a lot of those agreements were, you know, when they came around looking for support. And as soon as those municipalities learned what this project was about and how upset their community members were about it, every major town along that corridor, with the exception of, I think, Lewiston, which is where it would have a significant increase in some infrastructure investment there, basically came out against it. And so, yeah, there's been a huge pushback, especially from the folks in the municipalities that would be affected by it. Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's a big piece of this, is just the ability to go in and have multiple conversations that sound good to get the approval. I mean, we even saw in one area of the state that was highly sensitive, that CMP propped up a nonprofit, paid for it to be developed, to get local AstroTurf support, and then actually paid for their participation in the Department of Environmental Protection proceedings related to the project, in order to try and drum up what looks like organic support, but it clearly is not.
Yeah, and we're seeing the same thing here, exactly. And you know, the motivation for Avangrid and Iberdrola is magnified here in New Mexico. There's much more at stake than in Maine for them, because we're ranked 3rd in the nation in wind generation potential and 4th in the nation in solar potential. And they will not be prohibited from generation here. they would come here, and their plan is to build massive generation facilities. They're already doing one in relation to wind, and then exporting it to other markets like Mexico, California, Arizona. Does that surprise you? And what should we watch out for besides our rear ends?
The wallet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I'm guessing that their model would be, we'll get the ratepayers to pay for all this construction, and then we'll profit from generating and transmitting it out of state. Is that, I mean, that sounds like sort of what they're doing with your corridor. They're going to bring the power down through Canada, from Canada through Maine, and then distribute it out of in Massachusetts. It's that sort of their model there.
Yeah, I mean, the power will come down to Lewiston, and the reason Lewiston still supports it is the converter station is going to be located in Lewiston. The converter station is what converts the DC power coming in on that line to the AC power we're all familiar with and use, and then it'll head south, bringing that in. I think they're upgrading some AC transmission with that, but there's a chance now we're going to lock in some of our wind generation and gas generation and other things in Maine. But one of the issues is that New England is one big integrated market, and so and it uses locational market pricing. So it's a very complicated energy market. In New Mexico, Arizona, I mean, I worked in Arizona for quite a while trying to set up a centralized market out there. It was originally called Desert Star, then it was called West Connect, then it died. But so you don't have a centralized market out there that I've heard of, unless something resurrected from the dead. So the coordination of transmission, coordination of scheduling and dispatch is more on a bilateral basis. So what kind of transmission they're going to want to build, if they're going to want to export power, and who's going to pay for that transmission, you really want to watch that.
Right. Well, and that's the beauty of public power. And that's why we would like to get that passed, is because with that generation process potential and transmission potential, New Mexico's economy is so dependent on gas and oil that this could be a source of revenue that helps us to diversify. And so with Avangrid coming here, the potential for revenue goes to them, not to us. And so in that context, last question, do you have any advice for us? I mean, based on your experience and where we're headed.
So I think, Paul, one is to watch the opportunity cost, because, what's happening with the grid over the next decade has the potential to be highly transformative, right? And the ability to electrify transportation, the ability to electrify, heating, cooling, and generate with renewables to help, whether with climate or grid resiliency, et cetera, is hugely important. Avangrid has been shown not to pick very high on the tree unless they're forced to do so. They're gonna, if you stack up what in New Mexico they can make the highest margin of profits on, it's pretty predictable that that's where they're going to make their investment. And if distribution and reliability are towards the bottom, it's going to take a lot of heavy regulation to make sure they're in check. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to your regulators. I mean, if you feel like your regulation process is one that's highly independent and highly keeps utilities accountable, which I'm getting the sense from the comments that that's not there, I think it's important to push back and have that conversation about if that utility is going to be sold, does it make sense to sell it to its consumers? Because there's going to need to be, I suspect in New Mexico, like here in Maine, a significant amount of investment in the grid to allow it to really move in two directions, like we're seeing it move, instead of large centralized power plants and captive consumers. So I think it's important to bring that conversation up to say, does it make sense to have this other party sitting at the table while we make benefit investments for the benefit of New Mexicans? And that party being these investors that are just skimming money out of the project, right? And I think it's important to bring that to the table and make sure that's what's in the best interests of the people in New Mexico.
Bill, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you want to add some nice volunteer economists to your team. You know, we were lucky we had Dr. Richard Silkman, Dr. Dick Woodbury, and Dr. David Vail on our team, and they were able to show the economic savings if you form a consumer-owned utility who can then access tax-exempt financing at 2 to 3% versus 8 to 10% that the IOUs pay, plus the return on equity that they pay. If you're going to have to make a significant investment, and we think up here we're going to have to expand the T&D system by about a factor of 3 over 30 years, we think we'll save $9 billion just on the financing.
Yeah. Well, and one advantage New Mexico has is we have about the largest reserve fund in the country. Alaska has a slightly larger one than us, but we have $60 billion in reserve, and that can be used to leverage some pretty low interest loans to get that work done. Much cheaper than Avangrid could dream of doing, with the difference being we then accrue the benefit. And so I just want to thank both of you. I'm really looking forward to the listeners who have hung with us. We're going to have both these guys on in 2 weeks, on July 8th. June 8th, this happened already. July 8th at 6 p.m. on a Zoom webinar. And I would strongly encourage you to join us for that, because we'll be able to go into even more depth than we have today, as we have twice as much time. So thank you both, Bill and Vaughan, and have a great weekend. And thank you for your work in Maine. It's giving us a kind of template for what we need to do here, and we're definitely going to pay attention. So we'll be in touch, and thank you very much for your time.
Take care, Paul.
Okay, bye-bye.